going to be going over a grinder tool short here about playing Broadway hands out of position versus a blind still, and I'm going to make this a lecture video, as you can see. It's very strange for me to make a lecture video this short, so bear with me here. It's only about 7 slides, and it's not going to be as official as my other lecture videos have been, so let's go ahead and get started here. In this lecture today, we're going to be going over playing the Broadway hands out of position versus a blind steal. It's just essentially going to cover more than just that, maybe like all of the hands, but technically I like to focus on the Broadway hands versus the blind steal. And playing these hands are going to depend on 2 factors. One of them is actually the opponent, and the other one's going to be the raise size for pre-flop play, and then post-flop play going to be what the board texture is going to be like. All right. So pre-flop raise size here, I've covered this before. Essentially, the lower the raise size, the more we can call, and that's just because their odds are different. I'll show you the odds, what we're going to be getting in the percentage-wise on the next slide. And for a lot of these hands here, for the 4x and 5x raise pre-flops, we're going to be folding a lot of our marginal hands. All right, so we're going to be calling mainly with strong cards: ace jack, ace king, king queen suited. And it also will depend on the opponent. So like if our opponent is a really tight player, and somehow he decides to raise 5x in the button, maybe he's isolating somebody or whatnot, then we're going to be folding out a lot of the more marginal hands, like maybe even king queen. Folding out ace jack and ace queen though is pretty rough because you've got to put him on exclusively better hands than that. And to fold ace queen, you've got to put him on like, ace king, or really queens are better for us to not play the hand just because of the price that we're getting. So, but I think the 2x and 3x are going to be much more likely that you're going to be facing, and so those are the ones that are going to be focusing on the most. And for 3x, all right, there's a big disparity also for what you can call from the small blind, also what you can call from the big blind. Not only are the odds better for you in the big blind to call, but you've also got to worry about the big blind calling himself. And we're not talking about 3-bet bluffing in this lecture at all either. We're essentially, or 3-betting for value, we're essentially only talking about calling in the blinds when we're facing. So I'm going to be kind of ignoring ace king and queens are better, maybe even jacks for the better part of this discussion. So, all right, when we're facing a min raise though, like big blinds, we can call so many hands. And the reason why this is, all right, so the equity that we're getting to call on a 2x raise in the big blind, we only need 22.2% odds to call, right? And the small blind, 30%. Just because when somebody raises it up, two big blinds on the button, right? Plus the 1/2 big blind in the small blind, and then the 1 big blind itself already out there. There's 3.5 big blinds in the pot, only one of them to call. We don't need a very strong hand at all in order for us to call. And that's the reason why I said we can call with like pretty much any Broadway card, and you can call with even more hands than this too. But this lecture is only depending on like the Broadway cards. But the post-flop play will actually apply to non-Broadway cards as well in a couple slides here. And I've highlighted the 2x and 3x because, again, these are the most important ones you're going to be facing. And as you can see, like calling in the small blind compared to calling in the big blind, you have a pretty huge equity change here. Almost 8% facing the min raise, and almost 5% when you are facing a 3x raise. So 5% equity preflop can mean quite a bit, and it could be the difference between calling with suited cards and non-suited cards, which is what I have right here. In the small blind, we're only going to be calling with suited Broadways against a 3x raise, probably not offsuit. In the big blind, we can call with a lot of the offsuit stuff, and facing a min raise, we can certainly call most of the offsuit stuff too. As you can see, the odds that we're getting in the small blind facing a min raise is roughly the same that we're getting in the big blind facing a 3x raise, and thus your range for both of these should be very similar in both cases. So, the small blind calling a 3x raise would be very similar to the range you call a 4x raise in the big blind. So, and there's a very good relation to that. Now, you're actually going to you're going to want to be a little bit tighter in the small blind, only because you have that possibility of someone to act behind you, and that's kind of important. It also depends on the opponent left back behind you. If he's a really tight player, like a nit, and he won't squeeze, then they are relatively the same. But if you've got somebody behind you who likes to squeeze, maybe his name is nitreg, then, all right, avoid calling with your more marginal hands, as you're just going to be throwing money out of the window there. All right, so this is a very, very rough approximation on how we should be changing our play based on our opponent. And against both fish and regs who are raising up a really wide range in the button, we could actually be playing a wider range too, only because like we're playing a higher quality hand. Okay, so let's say against a fish, right? Depending on the raise size, they're the ones you're gonna be raising up different sizes, like all kind of crazy. They're not gonna know whether to raise up pot size or 4x or 5x or whatever. They're probably not really thinking about it too much. We're gonna be playing tighter against maniacs pre-flop, okay? Because they're going to put us in more tough decisions post-flop, out of position. But when we get to post-flop against maniacs, we have to be willing to call down lighter and not folding really top pair. We'll talk about that in a minute. And giving them an extra leeway with middle pair and stuff. Now, with the standard range against the fish, I would say in both small blind and big blind, just standard range. We're not using the stack sizes. You're going to have to use the combination of the two when you're playing. We're going to be calling with queen jack and twos are better pretty much all the time. And I threw twos are better in there because I don't want you to think that like I'm leaving that out. But we're not talking really about how to play those middle pairs right now. We're talking about very much just missed Broadway cards or Broadway cards themselves. All right, and we're playing against regulars who are blindsiding a lot. All right, how many times do you see aggressive players, being blind steal with hands like King 8 offsuit and Queen 9, and technically hands that you could probably blind steal with. We're not saying that they're playing incorrectly by blind stealing those marginal hands, but at the same time, all right, you can make their play less correct by playing better hands yourself. Okay, so if you're folding a hand like Jack 10 suited in the big blind, facing a blind steal from a regular who's raising up a ton of hands, Jack 10 suited has a lot of equity against the majority of the button's play. And the thing is, you don't need that much equity here, right? So Jack 10 suited probably is going to have roughly around 40% equity, if not 45%, against a very wide button range. And when we only need 30 or 35% equity, Jack 10 suited becomes a very easy call. And just on pot odds alone. And the great thing about pot odds is when we're post-flop, we don't have to do anything that isn't like minus EV or any kind of marginal place post-flop because our hand ranges are going to be so well-defined pre-flop and so well plus EV pre-flop that we won't have to do anything that marginal, right? We'll be very confident that we don't have to make marginal plays because we're already EV pre-flop. I hope I explained that right. Now, a good rule of thumb, right, when we're calling out a position is just to go ahead and we're going to try to induce bluffs with most of our pairs. And that's going to be our strategy. And yeah, essentially that means checking the flop a lot. And unless we hit like a really strong hand, all right, we're not going to be really changing initiative too much. And rather, we're going to be bluffing more when our opponent gives up, rather than, we're going to be bluffing more when our opponent gives up, rather than trying to really force our opponent to fold a made kind of hand. Now, we're going to be going over check raise bluffing on the next slide. First, let's go over what to do with top pair calling. Usually 2 streets, depending on the opponent, maybe 3. All right. And usually at least 1 street with middle pair, maybe 2 with middle pair. I very rarely will call 3 streets with middle pair. And with our hand selection that we currently have, we're actually going to hit a bottom pair like very infrequently, just given the hand selection that we have. All right, if you do flop bottom pair, right? Let's say you have Jack 10, okay, and in the flop comes Ace Queen Jack, and you've got Jack 10. Yeah, you could maybe call 1 street there. It depends on like the suits. Or Jack 10 suited. If you get Jack 10 offsuit on that board, we could probably just go ahead and fold. Jack 10 suited on the other hand, right, if you've got a backdoor flush draw, you're looking at maybe somewhere between 5 and 6 outs, 7 outs. It might be worthwhile to go ahead and to call there. Maybe we could even check raise, but we'll go into that here on the next slide. But the important thing to think about though is that you don't have to be too worried about your play post flop when you know you're playing well pre-flop and you're calling with great hands. A lot of the times, if you guys are calling a hand like Jack 9 suited out of position, then yeah, I'd be more worried post flop as well about how you're going to be playing that hand correctly because you're making maybe a minus EV call pre-flop. All right, so let's go over a quick slide on check raise bluffing. We only need to check raise bluff a small percentage to protect our nut hands, and what that means, we should be check raising our nut hands a lot too, especially on the drawly boards. So like nut hands would be like our sets. Maybe two pair, right? I'll actually go over that in the next slide. And the one thing I want you guys to do is, we don't have to bluff that much. Just because you called pre-flop doesn't mean you have to bluff post-flop. And in fact, most of the time you call pre-flop and you miss, you're going to be folding. It's essentially is that. You're not going to be bluffing every single time. It all depends on the opponent too. So if your opponent's going to be continuation betting a high percentage, then we're going to be bluffing quite a bit. If your opponent will check raise, I'm sorry, we'll see what the flop a lot, but then not really fire too many turns, then we're going to be bluffing on the turn, or we're going to be bluffing on the river when he checks behind. All right, so when to bluff? Well, first off, we need equity, and equity also refers to, in my opinion, outs right here. So we're going to need, I would say, between 5 to 8 clean outs. We don't want to really have more than 8 outs, and that includes 8 outs at set most of the time too. Depending on the 8 outs they are, if like 8 outs to the nuts, like an open and straight draw to the nuts, I wouldn't want to be check raising that. But if it's like a weak 8 outs, like a couple overcards, a backdoor flush draw, and a gut shot, well, that's actually a lot of outs. But a lot of those outs can be discounted. All right, the gut shot are usually like 4 clean outs to the nuts. The backdoor flush draw is 1 out. But your overcards aren't necessarily, all 6 of them are going to be clean outs. So you can discount those, and essentially we're looking at those kind of hands check raise as a bluff. When we have less than 5 outs, we don't have the equity in the hand to make the bluff. All right, and the EV of a bluff is entirely dependent on the equity we have in the hand. And so that's something we can control. Again, good examples of check raise bluffs: overcards and gut shots, overcards and backdoor flush draws. We're going to avoid bluffing with offsuit cards on the flop, just because it gives us very little equity or chances of barreling cards in the turn. We're also going to be wanting to look for a high c-bet percentage on our opponents with high steal percentages, because that means their ranges are going to be the widest in both scenarios, both the pre-flop, coming to the flop, and also continuation betting, and that's going to lead to the profitability more of our continuation bets when we have that guaranteed fold percentage there. All right, so one last thing: don't turn my hands into bluffs, and this is probably the hardest thing to do. Right? If we play ace jack, ace queen, maybe ace king without re-raising it pre-flop, if we missed, is ace high there a made hand? And that's one of the tougher questions, and it doesn't have an easy answer, yes or no. And how you play it each way is actually different too. Most of the time, though, in my opinion, if you call pre-flop with ace jack, ace queen, ace king, you're doing so because you have an equity advantage against your hand. All right, and we're not talking. Let's throw ace king out of that window here, because ace king is almost certainly going to be a made hand post flop. In my opinion, if we miss, it's still ace high is going to be good a lot of the time. Ace jack, ace queen, the other hand, all right, it's going to be pretty close, and usually it's going to be close enough that the pot odds we get facing this continuation bet are going to inherit a call. All right, now if you've got suited, you've got backdoor flush draws, all right, you can maybe you can check raise those kind of hands. If you want to have fun there. Most of the time, I would say I would call. And yeah, when we're out of position, it's really hard, just because if our opponent continues to barrel on the next street, then yeah, we're going to have to fold. But here's the thing: if the board remains like a pretty poor board, let's say like it's 7, 4, deuce, rainbow, and then like the turns an 8, and your opponent continues to bet, then chances are he's doing so incorrectly against your range. Because when you're calling the flop, you're calling him with all the pairs and these 3 overcards that you've missed. Well, the more and more that you call, the less likely you are to have these overcards, the more likely you are to have pairs. And so his 2 barreling becomes less and less correct to do so. So right away you can kind of realize you're probably going to be able to get equity or value from him later when you play against him later. Another thing to consider, though, all right, is check raising 2 pair. Is that going to be beneficial for you? And in 6 max, I would say I wouldn't worry about it too much. Maybe unless it's like bottom 2 pair, which if you have Jack 10 and Ace Jack 10 board, don't check raise that. But if you have Ace Jack on Ace Jack 10 board, all right, and full ring, you're I think a lot of times you're over-upping your hand, and you're gonna get looked up, especially from a regular. If you're playing against a fish, against 2 different opponents, you're against a fish. Check raising for value with top 2 pairs is usually pretty standard. Check raising bottom 2 pair, though, in both cases in a full ring game, probably aren't going to do you too many favors. In a 6-max game, though, it definitely changes things as people kind of be more aggro, and they presume that you're being much more aggro than maybe you really are. Another thing to consider, guys, is that when you can change the initiative of the hand, you turn your hand to a bluff. And what does that mean is, all right, if you were supposed to check call, or if your opponent raises pre-flop and then you lead out the flop, that's you changing initiative. And it's a good way to turn your hand into a bluff, too. It's not because now you're forcing your opponent to make an aggressive maneuver or to call, and he has to have a made hand to call you, or he doesn't have to have a made hand to bet. And I guess he doesn't have to have a made hand to call you either, but again, if he was going to be that spewy enough that we're going to be leading out and he's going to be like bluff raising us or something like that, then we're probably better off just go ahead and checking and letting him induce. I think leading the flop is a great line. Like if you don't want to check raise it with your 5 to 8 outs that you have that we talked about in the previous slide. And what we want to do though is avoid leading out the flop with our marginal pairs, like top pair, no kicker, middle pair, essentially, just because our opponent has like a high c-bet percentage. Then we're going to be getting much more value by checking and letting them induce. Now, we can lead the turn there for value, really, I mean, depending on the board, and we can lead the turn more if we like, maybe we have ace jack, ace queen, ace king, if we check all the flop with ace high, and then, we feel like maybe we can get our opponent to fold like a weak pair on the turn, something like that. It really is up in the air on how you guys want to do it. It all depends on the board, and if you feel like you're currently ahead of his current range, how are you going to be playing? And it does get it gets very muddled the longer you go into the hand there with the more marginal hand that you have. Most of the time, I'm not leading the turn after calling the flop, unless I have like a pretty strong hand. If I have like top or kicker, let's say we have ace queen on an ace high board, all right, and we check call the flop, leading the turn there, especially if there's a flush draw out there, it's going to be more in your favor, because your opponent will still call you with a flush draw. He's going to call you with a lot of weird hands. I wouldn't do it, though, with like a middle pair kind of hand, just because, again, we're turning our hand to a bluff. If the board hasn't changed much, if the board changes to the point where you become more of a drawing situation, and your opponent's going to be checking behind quite a bit, like maybe you have ace jack on the flop as a jack 8 deuce and the turn is 10, all right, and your opponent's not going to be two barreling that 10 very often. Leading that turn with ace jack is going to get you both a lot of value, and it's going to prevent your opponent from getting a free card, so it's going to give you the best of both worlds there. I think that was a good example. All right, so guys, this has been CodeRed Rules. I'm passing my allotted time for the grind and shorts. If you guys have any questions, let me know, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.